automatically manage our citations through Mendeley, which is a citation management tool. Continuing with the same thing, today we will discuss another important topic in research. And I would say this is a very important topic nowadays in research, because this is one factor which is leading to a lot of publications being rejected, a lot of publications being retracted after acceptance and after publication, after being available online. So this is a major issue that we have nowadays. And today our first session is on ethical issues and plagiarism in research. So I, Dr. Ritika Vasan, Associate Professor BVI CAM and Managing Editor BJIT, that is International Journal of Information and Technology, which is published by Springer and owned by Bharati Vidyapeeth Institute of Computer Applications and Management, will be taking this session of yours on ethical issues and plagiarism in research. I welcome you all to this session. And before we move on to discussing the different ethical issues and plagiarism, in today's session, we would all first try to understand what is the importance and consequences of ethical issues in research in the present times. And before we continue with the session, we will first try to see that what all outcomes I have planned for all my participants in this session. So by the end of this lecture, I hope that all the participants would be able to relate to the importance of, I would say, ethical issues or research ethics. I hope all the participants will also be able to identify plagiarism and its different types. I hope all of you will also be able to appraise the global bodies that are involved in evaluating issues of ethical misconduct and plagiarism in research. I also hope that you all will be able to predict the actual ethical issues which are involved in the current research nowadays. You will be able to minimize plagiarism in your research to avoid engaging in any issues of misconduct. So these are the basic learning outcomes I have planned for all my participants. I hope by the end of this session, you will be able to achieve them. Moving on from here, we will actually start by seeing that what would we actually mean by ethics. So starting from the very basics, I first reiterate how we can actually define ethics. The word ethics has been derived from the ancient Greek word ethikos, which actually means relating to one's character. And if I talk of human civilization, I would say character or a person's individual character is one thing that takes you to many places and that makes up your complete personality in this world. The word ethikos, however, itself has been derived from the word ethos that implies one's character or nature. So that is the most important thing. And if we intrude further, ethics or moral philosophy is actually a branch of philosophy that involves recommending the concepts of right or wrong behavior. So what do we mean by that actually? We can say that ethics are moral principles that govern an individual or a person's behavior or the actual conduction of an activity by an individual. So, and ethics are what can be actually used to define a person's own behavior and habits. For a simple example, I can say, I can pass a statement regarding any individual that, let's say, Ram has strange ethics. Similarly, we could have also said that Lord Ram was the epitome of human ethics. I'm sorry to hurt any kind of sentiments, but the usage of the name Ram was intentional in this case, only to communicate or to explain everybody what is the actual meaning of ethics. According to Nicholas Walliman, he had a book, he is a known writer, and in his book, Social Research Methods, that was published in 2006, he clearly stated that the value of a research depends as much on its ethical veracity as on the novelty of its discovery. So remember, the statement is having a lot of meaning because it simply indicates that to believe in the results or outcomes of a research project, we should first believe in the honesty of the researcher and integrity of the research methods they have used. As such, if people don't trust me as a researcher, as an individual, they will never trust my research work. And if they don't trust my research work, obviously you are not going to cite my work. So the whole cycle is interrelated. And the whole thing depends on your individual behavior, your integrity, your ethics. Talking about India, well, in India, even UGC has accepted that for the progress and development of a civil human society, human values and professional ethics are inevitable. UGC also states that higher education institutions have a responsibility to build a strong society. Thus, they should create an environment backed with human values and professional ethics. UGC also constituted an expert committee to develop guidelines regarding the same. And these guidelines have been detailed in Mulya Pravaha, which is inculcation of human values and professional ethics in higher educational institutions. So as per UGC itself, which is one of the, I would say, main stakeholder in higher education in our country, the success of an institute's mission and vision should be driven by value-based ethical behavior of its committed faculty members, officers, staff, and students. These stakeholders should be guided by the following four values that you can see in the figure that has been shared below. The first value in this case is what we call as integrity. Now, what do we mean by integrity? Integrity implies adhering to the code of duty in the righteous manner and in accordance with the principles of honesty, trust, transparency, and fairness. Wherever you are working, whichever organization you are working, your behavior should be integral enough that whatever is your code of duty, whatever is your responsibility, you should be carrying it out in the most righteous manner in accordance with the principles of honesty, trust, transparency, and fairness. What we have a habit generally nowadays, what the human civilization generally has a habit nowadays, that we try to find out shortcuts. Even if we have been given assigned any particular duty, we'll try to find out a shortcut. Remember, my friends, shortcut will make your work easy. It will reduce your hard work, but it will not improve your integrity as well as it will not reflect in your ethical behavior. So better don't try to strive to the means of shortcut. Put some hard work, but remember, your hard work is going to give you returns in the future. If not in the recent future, yes, in the long run, it will always give you return. The second basic capability is trusteeship. Operating in an efficient manner, ethical and true manner while ensuring group participation and a system of check and balances within an institution. That is very important. I work for an organization and I have no sense of trusteeship. The organization, whether it moves ahead or whether it moves beyond, I have no being, oh, it's for the organization. Let the trustees have a look for that. Remember, my friend, trusteeship is very important because if your organization grows, you are bound to grow. The next issue is harmony, balancing the diversity and difference through a culture of tolerance, discussion, and forgiveness among all the stakeholders involved. I may have students from diverse backgrounds. I may have colleagues from different backgrounds. I need to develop a culture of tolerance. I should, in my behavior, inculcate a culture of tolerance, discussion, and forgiveness among all these stakeholders, because different stakeholders are different human beings, and different human beings may have, I would say, different beliefs. They may have different mechanisms of operation. So I need to have a sense of tolerance to go along with all of them in a compatible manner. Accountability, adopting to standards, policies, and procedures in order to promote and ensure equal opportunity without any discrimination against an individual or a particular group for education, employment, promotion, and any other activities in an institution. That is another important thing that goes in the development and the realization of the mission and vision of an institution. Next, commitment, dedicating the vision and mission of the institution while evaluating, cultivating one's knowledge, skills, and attitudes to achieve excellence in due time and regulatory boundaries. That is another most important thing, because most of us, we think, oh, we are already working, we are established in this institution from a long time. Where is the need to grow? Where is the need to expand ourselves? And where do we have the time? Well, that is the most important thing, because until and unless you grow your own self, you will not be able to contribute to the growth of your institution. So that commitment to achieve the best in yourself and your institution is most important. Respectfulness, creating an environment of mutual respect, trustworthy and quality interaction, as well as fair participation by all functionaries and beneficiaries of the institution is again very important. Next, belongingness, fostering a shared vision of the institute to make everyone feel secure, supported, accepted, and included. That is the most important thing. And lastly, but not the least, sustainability, ensuring optimal resource utilization, be it economic, environmental, and social, to achieve long-lasting and safe future is the most important, I would say, characteristic to ensure the vision and mission of an institution through ethical behavior of all its stakeholders. And these 9 guidelines have been laid down by UGC in its own document, Mulya Pravaha. Well, this whole issue of ethics is not so new. Since the time of inception, even our father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, even he stressed on this fact, and he stated that value is a process that enables us to realize Satyam Shivam Sundaram. So that is the importance of values in today's time, I would say since time immemorial. Having understood this importance of values and ethics in a civil human society, we now move on to understanding the importance of ethics in research. Well, research is something called as scientific methodology, etc. So where did the concept of ethics actually reap into research? We also need to understand and appreciate that, because that will increase our own self-consciousness. Research ethics is nothing, but it is the responsibility of the researcher to be honest and respectful to all individuals that are affected by their research studies and results. Remember, history has it that early notable researchers were quite inhuman. For example, breaking and re-breaking of bones to see how many times they could be broken before healing failed to occur was an activity that was carried out by the Nazis, and it was actually an inhuman activity on the civil human society. Patients were injected with live cancer cells by the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, New York in 1963, which was again an unethical activity just in the name of research. So that has been, I would say, the dark history of initial research that happened. But obviously, talking about research in the present day, research involves the application of fundamental ethical principles to planning, conducting, and publishing of research. The guiding principles in this case are, again, there are 6 main guiding principles. The first one being autonomy and respect. Treat people as autonomous agents while protecting the rights of the children and elderly. That is the most important guiding principle of research nowadays. Whatever be your area of research, if there are certain stakeholders that are, you should treat them as autonomous agents and you should give them their due respect. The second is beneficence. Do no harm, maximize benefits, and minimize the risks that are involved in whatever research work you are carrying out. Some participant has unmuted themselves. I request all participants to kindly mute themselves. The next characteristic that we have is what is called as non-maleficence, non-harming, inflicting least harm possible to reach beneficial outcome. Obviously, I am doing my research. I want my research to come at some beneficial outcome. But that beneficial outcome I should achieve in a non-harming way without inflicting any kind of harm to any kind of stakeholders which are involved. Next principle is justice. Treat people fairly. Let all your work be fair, even if you are using somebody else's work. Better take full permission from the involved parties. Involve them in your work. There is no crime in that. Scientific validity. Validity refers to the degree to which the conclusion drawn from a study applies to the world at large. So scientific validity of your work should be maintained. And last guiding principle is obviously honesty, a facet of moral character that connotes positive and virtuous attributes like integrity, truthfulness, straightforwardness, etc. So these are the six main, I would say, guiding principles of ethics in research nowadays. And these guiding principles are what have been sought after all kind of known publishers who have some kind of publication ethics statement for their authors and their readers. Obviously, all this did not come, I would say, just at the click of time. This all has grown over the years. The importance of ethics in research, in publication, has grown over the years. So long ago, the academicians were considered to be very cautious of airing their ethical dilemmas they faced in their research and academic work. Remember, it's always good to read and talk about all the principles that we have just discussed. But long ago, the scenario was not the same as today. So academicians were always cautious of airing their ethical dilemmas they faced in their research and their academic work. As a result, in 1949, the Nuremberg Code, which was a set of 10 guiding principles for the ethical treatment of human participants in research, was first released. 25 years later, the National Research Act of 1974 followed, and later the Belmont Report 1979 followed suit. So these were the first few codes of ethics that were actually released to guide researchers, publishers, and all the stakeholders that will be involved in research. Come to the present times, come to the 2000s, and in 2003, the APA Science Directorate also laid down 5 recommendations. Some participant is on unmute. I kindly request all the participants to mute themselves, because in that case, my voice would not be audible to everybody. I think some of the participant is on unmute, which is causing this commotion in between. I kindly request all the participants to mute themselves. Professor Manish, if you could help us with muting all the participants. I suppose the participant has muted themselves. Thank you so much. So I'll start again. Back in 2003, come to 2000s, and the APA Science Directorate laid down 5 recommendations to help researchers steer clear of any ethical quandaries or any ethical issues they were facing in research. These 5 guiding principles were again, discuss intellectual property frankly. Remember, my work, my data, my research is my intellectual property. If you want to use it in your research, please discuss it frankly with the stakeholder involved. Be conscious of multiple roles in your research work. Whatever research work you are doing, you might be playing multiple roles. You might be the guide to your students. You might be a researcher yourself who is participating in that research. So whatever multiple roles you are actually playing in your research, be conscious of all those roles involved and all the duties or responsibilities that are involved along each of your roles. Follow rules of informed consent. That is most important nowadays. That if there is any kind of work that you're using from a third party agent, remember to take informed consent from that agent. Respect confidentiality and privacy, and tap into ethical resources, whatever, if any, that you have used in your work. So, from all this discussion regarding ethics and their importance in research, I think we all will agree to a common point that human ethics are not just important to a civil human society, but it is an important factor that is governing research and publication in the present times, especially when there are number of issues that are marring, I would say, true research. And so, at this point, I would again like to do a quick assessment of how my participants are involved with me. So in the next few slides, what we will do is I'll discuss a few real life scenarios with you. I request all the participants to identify whether these scenarios are ethical or unethical. You can use the chat window to give your answers. So the first scenario that we have is some medical interns, they conduct a research on the awareness of the risk of mortality due to COVID-19 infection in infants. Their research got recognition as the best research in their university. However, later they submitted the same paper to two different journals to see which publishes it first. So what will be your answer? Thank you so much. Prashant is already answering. It is not ethical. Shilpa ma'am, thank you so much. Not ethical. Namrata ma'am. So I think what about the rest of my participants? I think they're not involved in the session today. I would like to have answers from everybody. Well, thank you so much. All my participants are agreeing that this scenario is completely unethical. And yes, this is a typically unethical scenario. To categorize this scenario, all my participants are agreeing that it is completely unethical. And the reason for this being unethical is that this scenario will result in inadvertent double counting of the results of a study, thus distorting the available evidence. It will also give an incorrect idea about the number of publications in a given area and also weighs the review and publication resources of the journal. And let me tell you, with good publishers like Springer nowadays, they have their own smart team at the back end, which is actually tracking all such kind of submissions. So if I take an example of my journal, International Journal of Information Technology itself, and I have a submission on COVID-19, as an editor, before even I go towards that submission, in case the author has submitted the same submission to some other journal and my Springer team comes to know of it, I receive an immediate mail from my Springer team informing me about that duplicate submission. And as soon as an editor, I come to know of this duplicate submission, what will be my first reaction to it, or what will be my first counter action to it? I am simply going to reject the manuscript on account of duplicate submission. So this is the after effect that this kind of a practice can have on your work as a researcher. And as soon as your manuscript gets rejected on account of any kind of unethical behavior, kindly understand you are one of the participants in the blacklisting list of a particular journal. So better not get into this issue. An ethical solution to this kind of scenario can be that submit to one journal, wait for the journal's response prior to submitting to another journal. So that, I think, would be a more ethical scenario. Coming over to the second scenario, let's say you discussed a possible solution to a current problem with your colleague and best friend. You also discussed the novelty of the solution and the possibility of getting it patented. After some time, when you work on applying a patent for the same solution, you find that it is already patented and published in the name of your best friend and colleague. So how would you again categorize this scenario? Shilpa ma'am is quick to respond. She says unethical. Thank you, ma'am. What about the other participants? Thank you. Most of the participants again agree that the scenario is unethical. Well, absolutely correct. This is again an unethical scenario because scenario 2 is again unethical as my friend has failed to give due credit to the person whose actual idea it is. And remember, the idea comes under what you call as intellectual property. This again amounts to plagiarism. An ethical solution could have been my colleague should have discussed and taken my consent, and then they could have applied or included me as a co-inventor and a co-applicant while filing for that patent. So that could have been an ethical mechanism to go for this particular scenario. Next scenario that we can have is four friends decided to work together on a research during their vacation. However, one of them went abroad during the vacations and did not contribute to the research. Their friends included all four names in the presentation made at a scientific congress. So again, how would you classify the above scenario? Thank you, Shalini ma'am. That was a quick response. Ma'am says it's unethical. Shilpa ma'am also agrees on the same. Thank you, Manzoor sir. So I think most of my participants, Namrata ma'am, thank you so much. I think most of my participants agree, thank you, Dr. Vivek, that this is again an unethical scenario as only those participants who contributed intellectually to any particular work should be cited as authors. So a desirable ethical solution could be that any other participant or any other friend who has contributed in other ways can simply be acknowledged in the acknowledgement section rather than their name being included in the research and they being given undue credit in this case. So these were a few cases and these were a few real life cases that I have discussed with all of you. So these are some very common scenarios each one will have come across somewhere at some point during our careers. From this scenario, I hope that we all agree on the common point that it is necessary to have some common global research ethics in order to protect the participants, the patients, the society, the resources, or the researchers. We also need to ensure the accuracy of the scientific knowledge which is being disseminated to, I would say, the global human society at large. We also need to protect the intellectual and property rights of all the participants involved. So remember, breach of ethics in research contributes to what we term as scientific misconduct or academic dishonesty. And this kind of academic dishonesty is a serious offense that you should avoid. Good academic work should always be based on honesty. Honesty is desirable in all activities, be it academic, research, or related activities. Research misconduct includes falsification of data, improper assignment of authorship, claiming another person's work as one's own, which is plagiarism and which we will be discussing in detail in this session itself, misappropriation or unprofessional manipulation of experiments or of research procedures, misappropriation of research funds. So all these can be different kinds of research misconduct that can be carried out during any particular research project. Academic dishonesty or research misconduct or ethical issues or unethical behavior is what refers to committing or contributing to dishonest acts by those engaged in teaching, learning, research, and related academic activities. It may apply to students or everyone in the academic environment. So anybody involved in the academic environment, any stakeholder who is involved in the academic environment may contribute to academic dishonesty, scientific dishonesty, scientific misconduct, research misconduct, or unethical behavior of any particular kind. This academic dishonesty may take many forms, which can be broadly classified, and they have been classified by many researchers in the future. The first kind of academic dishonesty is what you call as cheating. Now, what do you imply by cheating? Cheating is unauthorized or use of information, materials, devices, sources, or practices in completing of academic activities. The second issue is what you call as plagiarism, which we'll be discussing in detail in the session itself. So plagiarism is when someone adopts another person's ideas, words, design, act, or music, etc., as his or her own without acknowledging the resources or, when necessary, obtaining permission from the authors involved. The next activity can be fabrication or falsification. This involves unauthorized citation, alteration of information in an academic document or activity. For example, you may artificially create data when it should have been created from an actual experiment. So that can be fabrication or falsification of data. The next is sabotage of your data or work. So that is disruption or destroying another person's work so that the other person can complete an academic activity successfully. So remember, academic dishonesty or research misconduct of any of these types is again completely unethical, something that we as researchers, as research guides, should avoid, and we should not even promote among our students. A number of factors may guide a person or a student. I again request the participants to kindly mute themselves. I think some participant is on unmute. There may be a number of factors that may contribute to this kind of research misconduct. I would say actually that there may be a number of factors that may actually promote this activity of research misconduct in humans, because ultimately we are all human beings and we are all governed by short-term and long-term benefits that may affect us or our professional careers. So the first kind of academic practice or dishonest academic practice can be peer pressure. I may have friends, I may have researchers who may pressurize other co-researchers to commit such acts. I may have a peer, I may have a friend who may have a large API and who may have a number of citations, who may have a large number of publications in a given academic year. Well, then it is up to me that I may not get affected by that co-researcher, by that friend, or by that colleague of mine. I should not get influenced, and I should take pride in whatever little work that I do. The second is performance anxiety. A pending promotion or API score may also cause some researchers to cheat. Third can be self-justification habits. People generally attribute their unethical practices to reasons like it was just once, or due to some other reasons like X, Y, or Z, or some of the above reasons. So I may just reason out with myself that, oh, it's just once that I'm doing it. But remember that once can even be quite heavy for you as a researcher, as an individual, on your social reputation as an individual, if caught at any point of time. And the next issue can be, obviously, the next cause can be unfamiliarity with what constitutes academic dishonesty. So that is the major reason why we have planned today's session. So some people may genuinely not know what constitutes cheating or plagiarism and may not ask anyone for any kind of clarification on the same. So that can be another cause of inculcating or indulging in any kind of research misconduct. The last will be lack of understanding about the consequences involved. Obviously, that is a major factor that is involved nowadays, that as researchers, as students, as guides, as mentors, we don't have an idea that what can be the consequences of research misconduct. So people may completely be unaware of that if caught, what could be the possible consequences, and maybe thinking of achieving only a short-term task like a pending promotion or increment. So these can be a few major causes that may cause research misconduct in academia. Well, having understood these reasons, let us broadly come and now understand the consequences of research misconduct. I told you the consequences of research misconduct, especially in the present times and especially with well-known publishers, can be quite grave. So the most immediate consequence of research misconduct is the immediate penalties that may be imposed by the university on the offender. Other consequences may be social or legal. Social consequences may be that the author or researchers may lose his or her own intellectual property, recognition, and even some possible income if they are involved in some kind of job. And negative publicity may also result from paper retraction by the journal, degree nullification if you have been awarded some degree on basis of that research, or the complete loss of your employment. Legal consequences may be that funding agencies, if any kind of funding agencies are involved in your research, they may take legal action against the university. And these actions could include fine, loss of future projects to the university. Future consequences, obviously, they may be the loss of the social respect, loss of integrity of that researcher, and even blacklisting of the researcher by certain publishers or journals. And remember, if you are stealing somebody's work, that means if you are inculcating or if you are involved in an act of plagiarism, the owner of the original work can even sue you. Even that is possible nowadays. And especially abroad in foreign countries, it is a common practice. So from all this discussion, I think we have all come to the conclusion that plagiarism or research misconduct or scientific misconduct or academic dishonesty in any of its form is completely unethical and I would say the most undesirable activity of doing research. So from here, we will now see that what is actually plagiarism. I hope all of you have heard of this word somewhere in your career, because it's a very common word nowadays in the research circle and especially with publishers. So talking about plagiarism, plagiarism itself is derived from the Latin word plagium, which implies kidnapping. So simply defined, plagiarism is the practice of taking somebody else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. So simply speaking, plagiarism is nothing. It is actually intellectual theft. You are not actually kidnapping the person. Instead, you are kidnapping the work or the hard work that has been done by the person. So remember, in the world of publication and research, plagiarism no longer is a small offense. It is a serious act of scientific misconduct. This definition of plagiarism by Oxford American Dictionary, that is the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own, we have already discussed. So I hope it is clear to everybody. Plagiarism has also been defined by the Merriam-Webster's dictionary to be the act of stealing and passing off the ideas or words of another person as one's own. And IEEE has also clearly defined plagiarism as the use of someone else's prior ideas, processes, results, or words without explicitly acknowledging the original author and source. So from here we come to the next point, that what are the different types of plagiarism. I hope I am visible and audible to everybody. Kindly confirm. Thank you, Amrita ma'am, because suddenly there was this long silence from your side. So I hope I am visible and audible to everybody. Well, thank you so much, all the participants. That ensures that all my participants are there with me. So from here we come over to discussing the types of plagiarism. If you talk about types of plagiarism, my dear friends, you will find a number of plagiarism types of classification of plagiarism to be enormous, because obviously nowadays plagiarism is being practiced in a number of forms. But over here in this session, I'll discuss some of the major types of plagiarism with all of you. And the major type of plagiarism that we have is the first, obviously, being direct plagiarism. It is also called as verbatim plagiarism or word for word plagiarism. Now, what do we mean by this kind of plagiarism? So, direct plagiarism is word for word transcription of a section of someone else's work without proper attribution and quotation marks. So, for example, I can word for word borrow from an unacknowledged source. And if I do this in my paper or my manuscript, this is what is attributed to as direct plagiarism. From here only, we come over to the second plagiarism, which is mosaic plagiarism. In mosaic plagiarism, it is not as direct plagiarism, but in over here, the writer will reuse a mix of words, phrases, and ideas from a source without indicating which words and ideas have been borrowed and or without properly citing the resource. So this is copying and pasting in a patchy manner. The next kind of plagiarism that we can have is what is called as self or auto plagiarism. And this is the most common type of plagiarism that is being practiced by authors. And generally the authors, if their manuscript is rejected on basis of the self or auto plagiarism, they generally debate that, oh, this is our own work, we did this work, and why is it being rejected? It should be accepted. We are the owners of this work. It is our own work. Well, friends, even self-plagiarism is not allowed. When a researcher submits his or her own work or mixes parts of previous work without permission from all the professors involved, that is what you call as self or auto plagiarism. I'll give you a very recent example of this self-plagiarism. We received a manuscript in our journal for acceptance and review, obviously. And on review, I find out that the same manuscript, the same title, and the same content is already available on Amazon in the form of a book. So obviously, as an editor, as a reviewer, my first reaction will be, I will reject that manuscript. On rejection of that manuscript, the editor-in-chief receives a mail from the authors of that manuscript claiming it to be their own work, and they cite a reason for that work being available on Amazon, that they presented the work initially in a conference, and after that conference, they wrote this particular paper, and they also took the rights of writing a book for that particular paper. They converted it into a book, and the book is available on Amazon. Now, dear friends, try to understand. As soon as you make a book, you publish, you write a book, you publish a book, you have transferred the copyright of that book to that particular publisher. So now the book is not just your intellectual property. You are the intellectual property owner, but the book is no longer your own intellectual property. It's also the copyright of that publisher. And now the same work you are trying to cite as your own work, and you are trying to publish in the form of a manuscript. So this is again unethical work. The issue of copyright and intellectual property that has come in this scenario will be discussed in detail in our next, in one of our sessions on IPR. But I hope from here with this example, everybody has understood the concept of self-plagiarism or auto-plagiarism. And I think as researchers, as writers, as authors, we should all take care that self-plagiarism or auto-plagiarism is also not permitted. It is again a punishable offense, I would say. The next kind of plagiarism that we have is what we call as accidental plagiarism. Shilpa ma'am, we can take your question towards the end. The next kind of plagiarism that we have is what we can call as accidental plagiarism. Accidental plagiarism is when a person neglects to cite their sources or misquotes their sources or unintentionally paraphrases or a source by using similar words or group of words and or sentences without appropriate attribution. So accidental plagiarism is obviously done accidentally by the offender, but obviously it is one of these kind of plagiarisms only that we are actually discussing. The next type is thesaurus, or what is called as paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is nothing, I would say, in the present terminology, in the common terminology, paraphrasing is nothing, but it is what you can also call as smart plagiarism. If one rewrites any part or paragraph in his or her own words, it is called as paraphrasing. It is a restaurant in which in your own words, it is a restatement in your own words of someone else's ideas without proper citation. This is again one of the most common types of plagiarism. Why? Because again, I said authors nowadays are very smart. We know that for plagiarism detection, any publisher will rely majorly on some plagiarism detection tool, and all plagiarism detection tool eventually they are all softwares. So when all plagiarism detection tools are all software is going to work on certain kind of logic. So even the plagiarism detection tool is going to work on certain kind of logic that it is going to find for similar occurrence of words after, let's say, every given number or a few number of words. So as an author, if I know about that, what I can actually do is that I can try rephrasing or paraphrasing every word after, let's say, a given sequence in order to avoid the statement being the same statement. So this is what is called as paraphrasing or thesaurus. But remember, even paraphrasing is a plagiarism, and that is also a punishable offense. The next kind of plagiarism that we have is cyber plagiarism. Obviously, it's a digital age that we are currently living in. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the digital interruption in our lives has even increased beyond limits, beyond boundaries. So cyber plagiarism is nothing. It is copying or downloading in part or in entirety research papers and ideas from the internet without proper attribution. And again, this type of plagiarism is again unethical. What we generally think that, oh, this particular paragraph is available on the internet, it was available on the Google, it was available on Wikipedia. I can easily cite it in my paper as it is. No need to do the appropriate citations. But remember, this kind of cyber plagiarism is again unethical, and this is again not allowed. Last kind of plagiarism, and this is a kind of plagiarism which I would say is free of plagiarism detection tool, because image plagiarism is one plagiarism that no plagiarism detection tool will actually catch off up till now, until the current time, that means till the time of the session. Well, image plagiarism is nothing. You can use an image or audio without prior permission or citation of the actual authors which are involved. So these are the different type of, I would say, the most common types of plagiarism that are being practiced nowadays. So how to avoid this plagiarism is the next issue. Obviously, as a researcher, what comes to my mind is that, okay, all the techniques that I have said, all the types of plagiarism that we have just discussed, they actually are most of the things that we practice nowadays. So how to avoid this plagiarism? Well, to avoid this plagiarism, you don't need to get demotivated by my previous slide. It's just a few simple practices that you need to I would say, inculcate in your writing in order to avoid plagiarism of any kind. And remember, this is not just a manual activity. These things need not be inculcated manually in my writing. I can even get automated help for this, that start writing your work using a citation management tool. The citation management tool will help you with your reading of research papers and your annotation. It will also help you for citing your research while writing of your manuscript. So that is one first mechanism that will help you reduce the plagiarism of your manuscript by appropriately citing each and every statement that you write, or each and every, I would say, things that you write. So few things that you need to inculcate in your writing habit in order to avoid plagiarism. The first one is obviously describe all attribute references. Any references you have gone through, any references that you come across that you refer to during your work, kindly describe all of them, cite all of them in your work. For short quotes, use quotation marks in the sentence. For longer quotes, indent the entire passage. And if you have used a table, chart, diagram, etc., cite the source directly below with a statement that prior permission has been obtained from all the parties that are involved. So these are a few best practices that you can actually bring into your writing. All sources, as per COPE. COPE is a Committee on Publication Ethics, and it's a global committee. We'll be even discussing that. But remember, as per COPE, all sources should be disclosed, and if large amount of other people written or illustrative material are to be used, appropriate permissions must be sought. So these are the simple practices that you can use to avoid plagiarism in your work. And trust me, if you follow these practices, your work will surely be containing only minimal amount of plagiarism. How to detect plagiarism? What are the plagiarism detection tools? So we'll have a brief of that also. So it is generally difficult to detect plagiarism, but information technology has made available many plagiarism detection tools which can detect or catch the involved plagiarism. World's top researchers, publishers, and scholars rely on Authenticate and Turnitin to detect plagiarism in their work. Though paid tools, these are the two most trusted world leaders in plagiarism detection. And though paid tools, but remember, these are the two world renowned leaders. And at the moment, Turnitin and Authenticate, both the tools are owned by the same agency. So they are sharing a common cloud database. So these are two plagiarism detection tool, which I would say have the most wide database for plagiarism detection. There are many free plagiarism detection tools also that you get on the net. The UGC itself, to all its member universities, they have provided the Urkund software for plagiarism detection. If you talk in manners of trust, that which plagiarism detection software to actually trust when trying your work for plagiarism detection, I would say don't trust any of the free plagiarism detection tools that are available on the net. They are completely untrustable because their database is totally untrustable. If you want, as a first step, if your university has Urkund, yes, you can go for Urkund. But again, your Urkund report will not be as detailed as compared to your Authenticate or your Turnitin report, because Urkund again has a lesser database as compared to Authenticate or Turnitin. Authenticate and Turnitin are the global leaders which are used by most publishers. But for Authenticate and Turnitin, obviously these are two paid products and the cost is quite heavy. So as individuals, it may not be possible for you to check your work with Authenticate or Turnitin. But don't rely to the, again, unethical practices of like, my friend is in a university which has an Authenticate or let's say a Turnitin membership. So I request my friend that I have written a paper before I submitted it to a journal. Kindly check my paper on Turnitin. What will happen in this case? As soon as your friend submits your paper as an assignment to Turnitin, it will add that assignments to its own repository. So now when you submit your paper to any particular journal or publisher, though your paper has less plagiarism, its plagiarism would be very high, and now the author, the publisher in that journal is going to do nothing, but they're simply going to reject your manuscript on basis of high plagiarism. So be careful while checking, while using these plagiarism detection tools also. So not to inculcate or not to get into any kind of undesirable plagiarism, I would say that. The next thing that we have is, remember, plagiarism issues are not strictly related to what we call as copyright. Shilpa ma'am, I'll be taking your question towards the end. I hope you don't have a problem with that, because at the moment it is only breaking the flow that we are going on with. So plagiarism issues are not strictly related to copyright issues. Understand, though plagiarism and copyright, these are two words which are quite confusing and they sound to be quite similar, but plagiarism issues are not strictly related to copyright issues. They are two separate issues, though there is a slight overlapping between them. Copyright is more of a legal concept. Copyright is one issue that we will be discussing in our IPR session that we have planned for in this FDP. So copyright is more of a legal concept, but plagiarism is more of a literary concept, and thus plagiarism is an ethical issue. Publishers are more worried about copyright violation. Publishers are even concerned about plagiarism in the present times. I will say that also. Remember, no publisher is going to accept a plagiarized manuscript in any case. So publishers are concerned about plagiarism, but they are also worried about copyright violation, because even copyright violation is taken up very strictly. Plagiarism as such, though nowadays in the present decade, plagiarism has gained a lot of importance. It has become a big issue. But remember, even in the past, plagiarism was never taken down low. It has had a very dark history. Doris Kearns Godwin, a historian who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1995, was found guilty of plagiarism. And later on, it was discovered that Goodwin has plagiarized in her own book, 1987 book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. As a result, Goodwin had to leave her position as a guest pundit on the PBS NewsHour program and resign from the Pulitzer branch. So that can be the after effect of plagiarism. The higher you are in academia, remember the consequences of plagiarism would be very bad for you. Jonah Lehrer in 2012 resigned as a writer for the New Yorker after he was caught self-plagiarizing on a number of occasions and fabricating quotes for a book of his. So that can be the ethical issues that can be involved with plagiarism. The work of Coke, obviously, we have discussed plagiarism, we have discussed ethical issues. Now, the problem that has been there with publishers actually. Remember, now what all we discussed up till now was just from our end as a researcher. The problem with me as a publisher would be that if I am receiving so many issues regarding plagiarism, where are there guidelines about what action to take? Whom should I discuss any plagiarism complaints or any plagiarism issues or any issues of research misconduct that I receive for a certain kind of authors in my journal? I may have my own publication policy. I may have my own publication ethics. I may have my own policies in place. But where is the common forum with whom I can discuss? Where is I would say, a forum where I can complain? Because as we discussed, copyright is a legal issue. So I can complain for a copyright. But plagiarism is more of an ethical issue. It's not a legal issue. So where do I complain for that? Well, due to all this problem with publishers, in 1997, the Committee on Publication Ethics was founded by a group of medical journal ethical editors. Initially, plagiarism and all these ethical issues in research were a major concern with medical journal editors only and medical researchers only. So in the biomedical field, it was a major concern. But yes, come to today, it is actually a common concern for all the fields, all the domains. So, but initially it was a common concern for medical journal editors as such. So in 1997, a group of medical journal editors, they came together and they constituted or they founded this Committee on Publication Ethics, which is commonly known as COPE nowadays. The Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, as it is commonly known, is nothing but it is simply a forum for editors of peer-reviewed journals to discuss their issues related to the integrity of the scientific record. It supports and encourages editors to report, catalog, and instigate investigations into ethical problems in the publication process. So simply try and understand that what is COPE. COPE is a common forum, I would say, that provides leadership in the thinking on publication ethics and practical resources to educate and support members and offers a professional voice in all the current debates that are going on. The committee was founded in 1977 by a bunch of friends who were editors and who helped each other out with any ethical problems that they had in their own work. So COPE as such is nothing. It's an informal editor support group. So tomorrow, if there is some ethical issue that arises in a particular manuscript in my journal, understand, COPE is not going to give a recommendation, or it is not going to pass a decision on that particular ethical issue. I, as the editor chief of my, my editor chief in my journal, is going to take the final decision on that particular ethical issue that has arisen. But yes, COPE will be a committee which is going to give me the general scenarios, or I will say the worldwide scenarios and the worldwide ethics, the worldwide ways out of solving that particular problem. So COPE is nothing. It is actually a growing appreciation of problems around scientific integrity. It is a series of high-profile scandals, even in the past, actually led to this constitution of COPE. The loneliness among the general editors was what actually led to the constitution of COPE. And the feeling that general editors actually needed to put their own house in order. They needed to have some kind of common guidelines, common principles to deal with unethical issues was what led to COPE. And as the general editor could not wait for an establishment from, let's say, some involved body like the government or something, they actually established COPE. But talk of the present time, COPE is a global body, and all Elsevier published journals, all Wiley published journals, all Springer published journal, all Taylor and Flanzer, so any world-renowned publisher you name, today is a member of COPE. All Elsevier published journal became a member of COPE as early as 2008. We as members of information, International Journal of Information Technology, BJIT, which is published by Springer, we are also members of COPE. So that is the power, I would say, that is the expanse of COPE in the present times. What are the basic aims of COPE? As I've already told you, that COPE is not a governing agency. It is not a court that is going to pass a, I would say, a decision on your ethical issue, and that is going to pass a conduct. But yes, the aims of COPE are still very widespread. COPE is going to advise on any cases of ethical misconduct that are brought by editors. It will publish an annual report of all the issues of ethical misconduct that have been reported to it by the various journal editors and the publishers. It will also publish guidance on ethics of publishing. So this guidance is there for editors as well as publishers. There are separate guidelines for editors. There is a separate guidance for, I would say, for publishers, for authors also. So COPE will also promote research into publication ethics. If you want to conduct research in publication ethics, COPE is also going to help you do that. It will also offer teaching and training. So these are the basic aims of COPE as such. And remember, COPE since its inception has had many cases, and the number of cases are rising each year. If you have a look at this brief graph, this table actually shows you a few of the cases of misconduct that were reported to COPE. So in 1997, COPE had only 18 issues of misconduct, out of which 12 issues were having evidence of misconduct, 0 issues were probably no misconduct, and 6 issues were such where nothing was applicable as such. 1998, the number of issues rose to 34, which is almost double. Again, the evidence was among 30 cases. 2 cases were probably no misconduct, but 2 cases were in the not applicable category. So that is how the number of COPE issues have been reported. And remember, this data is only till 2000, so the numbers are very small. You talk of the present numbers and the numbers are very large, because obviously the, I would say, expanse of COPE has grown. A number of publishers, a number of journals are member of COPE, and due to this large number, a number of cases are reported to COPE every year. Trust me, every known publisher has a separate team which is continuously working on detecting, the unethical cases in its particular journals, and taking a decision, investigating those unethical cases, first of all, taking a decision on those unethical cases in consultation with COPE. So that is the complete scenario or the order of conduction that happens currently along with COPE. And one major, I would say, consequence of plagiarism or unethical work in your work, in case it has been accepted and published by a journal, is retraction. But trust me, I would say retraction is the most humiliating task, because your manuscript will not be removed from the journal's website. It will remain available on the journal website with a background writing retracted manuscript. So retraction is one of the, I would say, most humiliating activities or most humiliating after effects of plagiarism that can happen. A simple example can be a study on wireless communication algorithm was retracted for it being an exact duplicate of a paper submitted to a separate journal last year, but the authors were different, and even it was unclear that how that given author or the given group got hold of that complete manuscript. So the retracted study that I am citing over here was actually energy aware resource management for uplink non-orthogonal multiple access, multi-agent deep reinforcement learning. It was published in the Elsevier journal Future Generation Computer System, and neither the author of the original work who was able to reach, who we were able to reach, nor either the journal involved say they know how the unpublished manuscript got into the hands of the other group. But finally, the paper was retracted, and this is how the paper appeared, still appears on the Science Direct website. And from here, this is all about plagiarism, ethical issues that we come. From now, I would take a slight U-turn over here. Up till now, whatever we have discussed, we have tried to understand it from an author point of view. We have tried to understand things, unethical issues, research misconduct, plagiarism from a researcher point of view. But now, if I slightly shift my focus to a publisher point of view, obviously, as a publisher or as a general editor, they receive huge number of manuscripts every day. And from those huge number of manuscripts, obviously, only a few, or I would say a handful of manuscripts are accepted, but a major chunk is rejected. So as an editor or as a publisher of a general manuscript, what are the reasons behind rejecting papers? I would be discussing a few important reasons behind rejecting papers. And these are some common reasons that not just I have, but I would say that most of the publishers of well-known journals actually agree by, or they would actually go for this. The first and the most important reason that will go for rejection of paper, and that will go for a very soon rejection of paper. That means as soon as I'll be receiving the paper in my panel, I might take this decision just within a day or two. So the first important reason for rejecting a paper is that the paper or the manuscript might fail technical screening. Now, what do you mean by this actually? Technical screening actually implies that the article, upon initial screening of the article by the publisher itself, not even by, let's say, the technical team or the editors involved, the publisher itself, the technical team or the staff of the publisher itself, they might notice that the article contains elements that are suspected to be plagiarized, or it is currently under review at another journal. I even gave an example of that previously. So republishing articles or part of articles, or submitting an article to one or more journal at the same time, or using text or images without prior permission from the original author is actually not allowed. And this may result to your manuscript being failing the initial technical screening itself. Think about it. Your manuscript will not even be reviewed. Your manuscript will not even be seen. It will fail the initial technical screening and it will be ultimately rejected. Other reasons that your manuscript might fail technical screening can be your manuscript may be found to be incomplete. Now, incomplete does not mean an incomplete paper as such. You will say that the paper is complete. Incomplete over here technically means that it may be lacking key elements such as the title, authors, affiliation, keywords, main text, references, or tables and figures. Any of these elements can found to be incomplete in the manuscript. The next major reason for rejection of manuscript is the English is not sufficient for a peer review process. Generally, you might have been seen with global publishers or renowned publishers. They generally provide English or a language editing service. Now, what is the reason for having that language editing service? The simple reason for that manual editing service is that obviously all human beings are not, I would say, very well versed with English. English is a language of communication. And okay, fine, it is a common language of communication in many countries across the globe, but it is not the common language of communication across the complete globe. So there might be authors from, let's say, a foreign country like any foreign country XYZ, where English is not the common language of communication. They have their own different common language of communication. So in that case, the authors, though they may write a quality paper, they may not be well versed with the English language and the grammatical rules and the syntax and semantics to be followed. So in that case, if those authors are writing the manuscript and the manuscript is, the English of the manuscript is found to be poor for the peer review process, your manuscript might get rejected in the initial technical screening itself. The next reason can be the figures are not complete or are not clear enough to read. That is another problem. Authors generally do what they have in habit. They know that, okay, figure plagiarism will not be detected by any plagiarism detection tool. So what they generally do is they copy figures from the net, or if you are doing some study and you will generate graphs and figures on tools like be it MATLAB, be it Microsoft Excel or any other tool as such, and you will take a snapshot of that results that you have generated and you will paste that snapshot in your manuscript. Now the problem is that when you take such snapshots or you copy it from the internet or you simply cut and paste it from some particular source, in that case what happens, the clarity of your figure actually goes very low. And in case of poor clarity of figures, again your manuscript can be rejected. So that is another reason that your manuscript might fail the initial technical screening. The article will not conform to the guide for authors for the journal they are submitting to. That's another important thing. Every journal has their own template. They have a guide for authors regarding how to prepare the manuscript for that particular journal. So in case you are not following that particular guide, again, your manuscript has a high chance of rejection. Your manuscript might be reporting literature review, but that literature review might be available at the end. Now, literature review at the end of the manuscript makes no sense, and it may not be allowed in the, let's say, template of the manuscript. So in that case, again, your manuscript may be rejected. Lastly, but again, not the least, your references might be incomplete, or they might be very old, or they might not be trustable, or your references may simply be, I would say, web references or simple hyperlinks. So obviously, in that case, again, your manuscript might be rejected in the initial technical screening itself. So that is the first reason why majority of papers are rejected outrightly by many journals. The second major reason for rejection of papers by publishers and journal editors is that your paper may not fall within the aims and the scope of the journal. And this is one of the common reasons for rejection. And I have seen that many authors complained of this reason if given for rejection. But as an author, I would say that you should appreciate if the journal is rejecting your paper to be not within the aims and scope of the journal, because the material that you studied may not be part of that particular journal. The study may be focusing on something different, or there may not be any novelty as per as that scope or aim of that journal. And this is a very important reason that you should appreciate for rejection of your manuscript, because simply try and understand every journal has its own aims and scope. They have their own readership. They have their own universities or libraries to which the journal is being shared with. So in that case, if your paper is completely out of scope, and even if out of lot of, let's say, fighting with the editors and a lot of, let's say, backdoor entry or anything like that, any unethical means, you even get your paper published in that journal, your paper is not going to meet its appropriate audience. And when the paper will not meet its appropriate audience, obviously the after effect of that is going to be you will have low number of citations. Now, as an author, that will be an undesirable thing for me as an author also, that I will not like to have a manuscript which does not get cited by other authors in the same domain. Instead, I would like to have a manuscript which gets cited highly by authors in the same domain, by authors who are working in the same domain as mine. So that is another reason for rejection of paper, and it's a very common reason for rejection of paper. The next reason can be, obviously, the manuscript might be found incomplete. Now, again, I will repeat over here, incomplete does not imply incomplete in the sense that you have only half written a manuscript and you have submitted it to a journal for review. Obviously, all of us are smart authors. We are all, I would say, responsible authors. So none of the authors will actually try doing that. But incomplete here actually implies that the article may only contain observations. It may not be a full study. The article may discuss findings in relation to some of the work in the field, but may ignore other important work in the same field. So that can be a reason why the manuscript is found to be incomplete. The next reason may be the procedure or analysis of the data can be found to be defective. Now, what do we mean by this? Obviously, if I am writing a manuscript and it's an experimental work, there is some procedure or analysis that I have done with the data that is involved. So how is it found to be defective? And how does the editor or the reviewer find it to be defective? Well, it can be possible that it is noticed that your study has lacked clear control groups or other comparison metrics. There is no comparison. You have done your study, you have done your experiment, but you have not compared your experiment with any, I would say, existing works or solutions that are already available to establish the effectiveness of your experiments. The second can be the study does not conform to recognized procedures or methodology that can be repeated. So you are doing your study, but you're not repeating, you're not reporting your procedure and methodology that you have taken in an appropriate manner, which is repeatable or which is as per as the global standards. So in that case, again, your work may be rejected. The analysis may not be statistically valid, or does not follow the norms of that particular field. See, every field has a particular norm of reporting the work, has a particular norm of analyzing things. So if your work or your analysis is not as per as the norms, again, it may be a suitable candidate. Your work can be a suitable candidate for rejection. And my general suggestion to authors and all my participants and colleagues is that never take rejection as a negative. Never take it in negativity or get demotivated by it. Instead, if your manuscript is rejected, always take it in the positive note that you now have a chance to improve the quality of your manuscript. The reviewer of your manuscript or the editor who has reviewed your manuscript, they might have identified such loopholes in your manuscript which you as the author may not have identified. So always take it in the positive sense and rework on improving your manuscript. So the next reason can be the conclusion could not be justified on the basis of the rest of the paper. Now that is again a very important. You wrote the rest of the paper very well, but while coming to conclusion now there, because a lot of effort had already been done, you somehow lost interest, or you told your student that, okay, you write the conclusion, and you never rechecked it and you submitted the manuscript. Well, in that case, what can be found is, or what can be noticed is, that the arguments that you give in the conclusion might be illogical, unstructured, or invalid. The data that you have used may not support the conclusions that you are reporting, or the conclusions may ignore the large portions of the literature that you have actually referred to. So in those cases, again, your manuscript may be rejected. Next important reason can be that your manuscript is found to be simply a small extension of a different paper, often from the same authors. Now, this is something that is close to what we discussed as self-plagiarism. Well, it may be noticed that in your given manuscript, your findings are incremental, but they provide no advance to the field. Your work is clearly part of a larger study which has been chopped up to make as many articles as possible. Again, a common example, I can give a recent example in this case, that I received a manuscript and the authors were claiming that the manuscript was an extension of their work of, let's say, the previous manuscript. But when I went through the manuscript, I actually noticed that the authors were only reusing the figures they had used in their previous work, and they were trying to only manipulate the complete explanation of figures to produce a new manuscript. So obviously, in this case, your manuscript will ultimately be rejected. The next reason can be your manuscript is incomprehensible. Again, this is something that is related to the language, that the language, structure, or figures are so poor that the merit cannot be assessed for your manuscript. In this case, it is better to have a native English speaker to actually read through your manuscript. And even if you yourself are a native English speaker, it's better to take help of a friend or, let's say, a professional who has better knowledge of the English grammar and the syntax as compared to you. And that is why most of the world-renowned publishers, they also offer language editing services. So if you don't want to use a friend, or you have no such friend you can trust for, you can actually use the publisher services for editing of your manuscript. The last reason why your manuscript may get rejected is it is boring. Now, don't take any offense by the word, but the actual meaning of this word boring in this case is not that your manuscript is a film and that was not very interesting. The actual reason over here is that your manuscript was found to be non-archival. It was not incremental or of marginal interest to the field as such. So this is simply something like that your manuscript is not adding any new, I would say, novelty to the existing literature. The question behind the work is not of interest in that actual field. That is again the aims and scope of the of your field, actually, not the journal. And or the work is not of interest to the readers of the specific journal. So this can be these can be a few major reasons for why publishers may reject your paper. Remember, this publication of a scientific manuscript is the result of several months of careful planning and hard work. And this careful planning and hard work is not just by the authors themselves. It is also by the publishers, the reviewers, and all other stakeholders who are involved in, I would say, reviewing a manuscript, scrutinizing a manuscript, and finally publishing a manuscript. So in the best interest of science, the work should be carried out honestly and objectively without bias, and the result should be reported truthfully. So that is, these were the top reasons why a publisher would reject your paper. But obviously, I would not like to end on a demotivating note. So there are reasons why your papers or your manuscript will also stand high chances of getting accepted in general, in journals. And the top reasons why a manuscript generally gets, why some manuscripts, I will say, they generally get published is the first reason being that the manuscript provides important insight into an important issue. Simple example you can take by explaining if the manuscript explains a wide variance when, let's say, the numbers are spread out from the mean or the expected value, or by shedding light on an unsolved problem that affects a lot of people, obviously your manuscript stands a higher chance of accepting. The second reason can be the insight is useful to people who make decisions. And in this case, the decision-making power can be particularly long-term organizational decisions, or in our particular field or our particular area of work, if your manuscript can provide useful insight to its readers to help them make, I would say, decisions. So in that case, again, your manuscript has a higher chance of acceptance. The next reason can be the insight is useful or used to develop a framework or theory which can either be a new one or advancing an existing one. Even in that case, your manuscript will stand a very high chance of acceptance. The next reason might be that the insight that has been given by your manuscript simulates new and important questions. Obviously, COVID-19, if we talk about, it's a general pandemic, it's a new pandemic that has, I would say, engraved the complete human society. Now, in COVID-19 also, if I talk about research in the times of COVID-19, the research in the times of COVID-19 has also gone through a number of phases. The initial phase of research in COVID-19 was that any manuscript, obviously big publishers like Springer, Scoopers, Elsevier, they have made all COVID-19 research that is published completely free of cost available to all the readers. But what are the stages in this COVID-19 research? Initially, we like to publish any manuscript which was even discussing the COVID-19 pandemic. It was discussing that, okay, what are the challenges that have been put forth to the human community by the COVID-19 pandemic. From there, we came over to a phase where a lot of solutions were given: machine learning enabled solutions, AI enabled solution, deep learning enabled solution to predict that, okay, which particular area or which particular country in the globe will have how many cases in, let's say, the coming 2 months, the coming in the coming near future as such. From there, we came to a phase where now AI, machine learning, deep learning was being used in a big way in order to actually predict that the number of mortality due to COVID-19 in a given area. But now, if I talk about COVID-19, we have all learned how to coexist and how to grow with COVID-19. So in that case, obviously, this kind of research, which is predicting the mortality rate or the number of infections due to COVID-19, has actually gone down. Now, what is being stressed or what is being looked out for is solutions to persist with COVID-19. So obviously, I as an editor will prefer to have a publication or will prefer to have a manuscript by an author who tells me that, okay, how can robotics or how can virtual reality or how can AI, machine learning, deep learning be used in order to find out mechanisms for, let's say, maintaining social distancing between people, appropriate social distancing between people. How can it be used to minimize the risk of infection when people together are working in a complete area? So the insight that is simulating any new or giving a new answer to important questions, those kind of manuscripts also stand a higher chance of acceptance. The next reason can be the methods used to explore the issue are appropriate. You have obviously used appropriate methods, globally standardized methods to solve that particular issue. And remember, your method should be new. Your method should not be old methods which have already been used and published to solve that particular issue. The next reason can be the methods used are applied rigorously and they explain clearly why and how the data that is given, it supports the conclusions. So in that case, again, your manuscript will stand a higher chance of acceptance in case you have appropriately reported all the methods that you used, you have explained why you chose the particular set of methods and how you have used the data to generate your result, and your conclusion supports the same thing. So in that case, even if your manuscript is this well structured, it is all well connected, your sections are all well connected, there is an appropriate flow from the beginning, I would say the introduction to the conclusion, your manuscript stands a very high chance of acceptance. Next reason can be connections to prior work in the field or from other fields are made. Yes, that is another important thing. Not just in this case, connections do not imply connections to your own previous work, connections to all the work that have been done in the field. A review manuscript, when does it stand a higher chance of acceptance? A review manuscript finds a higher chance of acceptance in case it has explored all the prior work that has been done in the field or from other fields which are involved in that particular domain. So that again increases the chance of acceptance of that article with any publisher or journal as such. And lastly, the article tells a good story. Now, in this case, again, I would not say story does not imply a story. Story in this case actually implies that the actual article itself actually is reporting the problem handled in an appropriate manner. There is appropriate flow of the manuscript. There is appropriate connection between the different sections that are given in the manuscript. So in that case, obviously, such a well-structured and a I would say, well-designed, well-written manuscript stands a higher chance of acceptance as compared to all other manuscripts which are rejected. So these were a few reasons why manuscripts are accepted or that promote acceptance of manuscripts with publishers. I have also discussed reasons for rejection of manuscript by publishers, and that was my complete session on ethical issues and plagiarism in research. I hope by the end of this session, all of you have successfully attained all the outcomes I had initially set for you. So now you are all, I would say, more informed researchers about the ethical issues, the issues of dishonesty and misconduct involved in research. You will all try to refrain from any kind of or any acts of plagiarism as such, and you will all try to guide your students to write good manuscripts which stand a higher chance of acceptance with publishers. And you will also be a motivating factor to your students. You will also motivate your students to actually produce work or write manuscripts, improve manuscripts in case they are rejected by publishers. So that is all about my session. I can see there were a number of questions in between by a few participants. So we are now ready to take the questions. I'll stop sharing my slides so that I can see the questions. Just give me a minute. In case any author would like to unmute and would like to, any participant would like to unmute and they would like to ask a question, you are most welcome. Shilpa ma'am, sure, you're most welcome. I'm sorry I had to make you wait.
No, thank you, ma'am, for a very nice insight into this plagiarism issue and the unethical practices. I have 2-3 queries which I have been asking many speakers, but yes, I am still in the dilemma. The UGC has given the guidelines for the PhD submission that the plagiarism should be less than 20%, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And it should be, if possible, it should be less than 10%. But in any case, it should not be more than 20% of the PhD thesis.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, and in all the institutions, probably 2 SCI publications are a must for the degree to be awarded for the PhD submission, right? Now, if a student has already published 2 papers in a SCI, and whenever he or she is going to, go through this Turnitin software, the plagiarism is going to be more than that because our own papers are, shown in the detailed analysis. Now, in some institutions, like it is said that your author's paper can be deleted from it, and the remaining percentage should be less than 20%. Is that right or is that wrong?
Ma'am, frankly speaking, that is totally unethically incorrect. I know that this is an anomaly with our Indian education system and our Indian research system as such, that a student already has put in so much of effort in publishing papers in, let's say, SCI index journals, etc. And then they have to write a thesis that is explaining their complete work. But ma'am, try to understand the issue that is involved over here. I will give you a bit of insight into the intrinsic issue that is involved in over here. And for the plagiarism, that is a separate issue otherwise. See, try to understand the papers that are published in some SCI journal, or let's say any journal XYZ. Now, when the paper gets published, when the paper gets accepted and published, the copyright is transferred by the author to that particular journal. But when you talk about writing a PhD thesis and submitting it to your university, now your university is the copyright owner of the thesis since the time they have awarded you the PhD degree. And for certain university, for most of the universities nowadays, all the theses that are awarded, they are even made available on Shodh Ganga. So if you try to understand it from the legal perspective, there is a different copyright owner of the paper that has been published by the student, and there is a different copyright owner of the thesis that has been written and submitted by the student. So that is the reason why only, I would say, a limited degree of self-plagiarism is allowed in both these cases. Obviously, I know many times it is a actually tiresome process for the student trying to remove their own self-plagiarism from their thesis. But that is the actual reason why self-plagiarism, even in thesis, is allowed only till a limited number. The guidelines might differ from university to university because at the moment there is no common guideline. But hopefully with the introduction of National Education Policy 2020, which is advocating a common research body which is going to overlook the complete research and development R&D that is happening in the country across all the universities. Hopefully we'll be coming across all these limitations that have come with research. But talking about the present time, that is the reason why there is this gap in publication.
No, ma'am. We all are in the research fraternity, and we all know when writing down when a student, then that means then 2 SCI publication criteria should not be kept. No, one person who has worked for three long years or 4 long years has been able to get two or three good publications. Then naturally one is going to use all those results, all those graphs, and all that interpretation, and everything is going to be almost the same. How much can you change? No, I think that should be a point which should be put up at the right platform so that a decision can be taken on it that at least the student's paper should be deleted. Now, in some universities, it is allowed. Some universities, they say that your own paper you can delete and then it should be less than 20%.
Ma'am, I do agree, but then again, there are different norms with different universities.
Yes,
and
there are.
if we talk about foreign universities, I have even seen foreign universities where they simply say that, okay, a student who is pursuing research for, let's say, a given period of time, and they have a few number of publications, like in India, we have SCI publications. So if they have a few number of publications, they don't call for a thesis in that case. The student submits their own PhD degree with their so-called publication. Myself, at a personal view, I find that much more logical. But if you talk about the Indian scenario, obviously, currently we have these particular regulations. And that is what I was saying, that yes, we do identify these problems in our research field. And I think all of us are unanimously agreeing to that. But let's hope that in the future, there will be a policy that will overcome all these limitations and our views will be taken care of.
Yeah, because it's very important. I never, everybody, no exact answer is there with anybody. Everybody says, yes, you should try and it should, but we don't have any set guidelines. And the rules are now becoming very stringent for a PhD thesis to be submitted.
I do agree. I absolutely agree with you, ma'am. I have given you the internal intrinsics also which are involved and what is the reason behind this anomaly. But yes, even I would unanimously agree with you on your concern. But let's hope that, because see, these changes have to be made in the guidelines and there need to be a common guidelines. So
but now they have not said in the UGC I read, they have not said anywhere. They are saying 20%, it should be less than 20%, but they are silent about all these things. Ma'am, every university is taking its own step.
That is the thing, ma'am. That is the problem over here, that the UGC has given the guidelines, but the implementation of the guidelines, they have given the universities a free hand in that implementation. And because the universities have a free hand in that complete implementation, so the universities are implementing it with their own whims and fancies. So that is why I am hopeful that with NEP 2020, there will be a common set guidelines which all the universities will have to abide by. And in that case only, I think we can overcome these anomalies which are there in our present system.
And one more question, ma'am.
Yes,
you said that like we normally do, like if I am in a good institute, I have Turnitin access to me. My friends send my paper, yeah, please check it. What's the plagiarism? But it is like I do not put it in the repository.
Ma'am, that is the most important thing.
If it is going in the repository, I am facing a problem. One of my students got it checked from IITM, and IIT Madras is not removing it from the repository. And when now she's on the verge of thesis submission, her 20% flag is coming just because of that.
Absolutely correct, ma'am. That is the most important thing. And that is why I told that as authors, we should refrain from this, because generally universities, etc., they don't have this setting in their account to not add their assignments to the repository. And generally, if you even request them, the Turnitin administrator over there, he is not going to do that, because getting it removed from the repository implies that the Turnitin administrator needs to write a mail to Turnitin itself to remove it from their repository. And Turnitin does it within a period of 5 to 7 days, working days actually. So that is not the problem. The problem here is that the Turnitin administrator will have to take a permission from the, let's say, the university chancellor, and that will be a question on his job, that what did he do? So that is why generally at universities, they don't delete it from their repository. And while checking also, they don't have this setting involved that kindly don't add to the repository. So that is one major reason why much of the work, I would say genuine research work, becomes wasted due to this.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question? Any other participants have? Dhanke Jyoti Atul had asked a question. Turnitin plagiarism, please guide after session, please. Ma'am, any question you have? I hope you have understood Turnitin from my discussion with Dr. Shilpa also. But if you have any other question, any other participant, if you have any other question, we have time for question answers.
Yes, ma'am. I want to know just कि Turnitin there is a मतलब कि amount we have to pay to check plagiarism by Turnitin. That's why.
Ma'am, the amount to be paid, I don't have the actual amount, but the amount Turnitin subscription is generally not an individual subscription. It's generally a university subscription with certain number of minimum participants. That means Turnitin will give you a license to use Turnitin for a period of 1 year with a minimum license of, let's say, 10 or 12 users at least. So 10 or 12 is a very smaller number. The license includes a much higher number of users. And the license fee, this license fee itself is somewhere in lakhs. So at an individual level, I will say, obviously, this is completely unaffordable.
There is any institute?
Ma'am, there is no other institute, but yes, another unethical practice I have seen nowadays is that there are a few people who have who take a small amount of amount from you as an annual membership, and they give you one license of their Turnitin. But in that case, try to understand, you are not the license holder of the Turnitin in that case. The license holder of the Turnitin is that original individual. You are only getting I would say, an account from that license to use Turnitin. But in that case, again, if you are using Turnitin, remember the repository is the name of that particular person. So if you are checking your assignments after purchasing this kind of Turnitin, remember to not add your assignments to your repository. But as a person myself, I would not recommend you to go into such practices, because again, they are unethical practices. Any other question any other participant has? We still have a few minutes. If you have any other questions, you may please ask me the question. Dr. Itiram says thank you. So in that case, if no other participant has any question, we come to the end of our first session for today. Our second session today, which will start at 4, will be taken by Professor D.K. Lobial from JNU. He will be guiding us on how to prepare write research proposals for research projects, which is again another important thing that will help us get research projects, funded research projects from government and all the funding agencies that is involved. We'll be closing this room now, and we'll be reopening the room at 3:45 for the next session. So I request all the participants to kindly join us on time, because we will be starting with our second session also sharp at 4. So thank you all the participants today. We'll meet again at 3:45. Professor Manish, you can close the room.